threw hot coffee on the floor and humiliated the new waitress in front of everyone. What he didn't know was that she'd be the one to change his life forever. Because sometimes the person you try to tear down is the only one strong enough to hold up a mirror. And when she looked him straight in the eye and didn't back down, that's when the real story began. What happened next, no one in that cafe could have predicted. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps stories like this alive. The bell above the cafe door chimed gently as Sophie stepped into Cafe Central, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a worn second-hand coat. The air inside was warm, scented with fresh coffee and cinnamon scones, but she still caught her breath from the bite of winter outside. She paused at the entrance, not out of hesitation, but to take it all in. It had been years since she walked into a place not as a visitor or caregiver, but as someone trying to reclaim a piece of herself. Sophie was 32, and this was her first real day of work in almost 10 years. For the past 7, she had cared for her mother through a slow, heartbreaking battle with cancer. She had forgotten what life outside hospital rooms and scribbled grocery lists felt like. This little cafe with its scratched tables and fading chalkboard menu felt like a fresh start in a book. She thought she'd stopped writing. "You're Sophie, right?" A kind voice behind the counter pulled her attention. A woman in her late 40s, apron tied tightly around her waist, stepped forward with a warm smile. Her eyes were soft, lined from years of early mornings. "I'm Dina, owner, barista, dishwasher. Depends on the hour." Sophie smiled. "Yes, first day." Dina handed her a clean apron. "You'll be fine. Mornings are easy. Afternoons get loud. Don't let the regulars scare you. They bark more than they bite." Sophie slipped into the rhythm quickly. She learned how to use the register, where the sugar packets always ran out, and which tables wobbled if someone leaned the wrong way. She wasn't fast yet, but she was steady. And sometimes steady was exactly what the world needed. By 10 a.m., the cafe buzzed with its usual soundtrack. Keyboards clacking, spoons tapping porcelain, hushed conversations floating around. Sophie was clearing table 5 when she felt it, a shift. Like someone had turned down the volume knob on the whole room. Outside, a sports car purred to a stop. Then came the sharp sound of expensive shoes against tile. She turned. He walked in like he owned the air. Richard Harrison. Even Sophie, out of touch with business headlines, recognized him. Billionaire investor. The guy who bought struggling companies and flipped them like fixer-uppers. Also known for being difficult. Dana had warned her that morning. Good tipper, terrible manners. Treated staff like they were invisible until something went wrong. Then suddenly you existed, loudly. He didn't smile, didn't say hello, just pointed at a booth near the window. Sophie, being closest, approached. "Black coffee, hot, no sugar." "No delay," he said without even looking up. Sophie scribbled it down, pressing the pen hard to hide the slight tremor in her hand. The coffee machine hissed. Less than 2 minutes later, she returned with his drink, setting it gently in front of him. Her voice was calm, fresh and hot. "Let me know if you need anything else." He took a sip and set the mug down with a sharp clink. His face twisted, less pain, more disappointment. He looked at her for the first time. "This," he said loudly, "is lukewarm." Heads turned. Dina paused mid-polish. Sophie felt the room watching her. Like every pair of eyes added invisible weight to her back. She started, but he cut her off. "Do you not understand what hot means? Or is this just what I should expect from the new girl?" His tone was cold, sharpened like a blade. A power move. Sophie blinked. She didn't shrink. Something inside her expanded instead, quiet but solid. "I'm sorry, it's not how you like it," she said, steady and clear. "But it was brewed less than 2 minutes ago. That's the temperature it comes out." The room went still. Richard stared, unimpressed, waiting for her to fold. But she didn't. "If you'd like a replacement, I'll bring it," she added. "But please don't speak to me like that again. Not here, not anywhere." A spoon dropped in the back. A cough tried to cover it. She stood firm, so did he. Then he leaned back, one arm over the booth, like he was studying her. "Not as a waitress, as a puzzle." "You're new," he said, more curious now than condescending. Sophie nodded. "Yes." He took another sip. This time, no flinch. She turned and walked away, heart pounding in her ears. Dina looked at her, equal parts worried and impressed. "You okay?" she whispered. "I think so," Sophie said. But she wasn't sure, because something in Richard Harrison's eyes hadn't looked like anger. It looked like curiosity, and she didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, the wind cut sharper. Sophie arrived early, cheeks pink from the cold. Dina was already prepping lemons, humming under her breath. The café smelled like espresso and warm muffins. Sophie was halfway through wiping tables when Dina called out, too casually, "He's back." "No name needed." Through the foggy window, Sophie saw the unmistakable silhouette of a black Aston Martin slide into an illegal spot right in front of the café. Because, of course, Richard Harrison didn't follow rules. He made them. He entered like the air adjusted to make way. Coat perfect, scarf perfect, hair perfect. He said nothing to anyone, just sat at the same booth and pulled out his phone like he owned the hour. Sophie walked over, calm. "Good morning." "The usual, black coffee, no sugar?" He nodded. "Make sure it's hot this time." She brought it to him with care. Freshly brewed, extra hot. Without a word, he pushed the mug to the edge of the table and flicked it. The coffee splashed to the floor, the cup shattering. Hot liquid soaked her shoes and apron. The café froze. He leaned back, still lukewarm. For a heartbeat, Sophie didn't move. Not from the heat, from the sting. But what she did next wasn't about pride. It came from the grace of watching her mother fight cancer, from holding her own dignity when no one else offered it. She stepped back from the puddle, met his eyes. "That coffee was brewed 90 seconds ago. Good," she said, voice low but steady. "It burned through the cup. It spilled on me. So I promise you it was hot." He didn't react, just stared. She continued, "I know you're used to getting what you want, but this cafe isn't your boardroom, and I'm not one of your employees." She stepped closer, not aggressive, just real. "I serve people with kindness and respect, and I expect the same in return. Not because I demand it, but because it's human." No one moved, not even the espresso machine dared interrupt. Then calmly she crouched and cleaned the mess, graceful, composed unapologetically herself. Dina rushed over. "You didn't have to do that. You could have walked away." "I don't walk away from things that matter," Sophie whispered. Richard stood. For a moment she thought he'd storm out. But he didn't. He just looked at her. "You're not afraid of me," he said softly. "Should I be?" He didn't answer, just turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing like punctuation, on a sentence no one expected. The door chimed behind him. Dina stared. No one's ever spoken to him like that. Sophie shrugged. Maybe no one ever needed to. "You stood up to Richard Harrison," Dina said, still stunned. Sophie shook her head. "I didn't stand up to him. I stood up for myself." She looked at the puddle, the broken cup, her stained shoes, but her hands weren't shaking, and something inside her shifted. Not pride, not defiance, just the first crack of something new. What Sophie didn't know was that Richard hadn't left because he was angry. He left because, for the first time in years, someone had seen him, and that feeling would stay with him far longer than any insult ever had. For several seconds after Richard Harrison disappeared through the glass doors, time stood still inside Café Central. The door chimed softly as it shut behind him, but no one moved. Conversations didn't resume. No coffee was sipped. Even the muffins in the display case seemed to hold their breath, like the oven itself was unsure of what had just happened. Sophie remained frozen, a damp cloth still in her hand, the bitter scent of spilled espresso clinging to the air. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was something else, a pulse she hadn't felt in years. It reminded her of the still, steady presence she'd felt while sitting beside her mother during those long nights in the hospital, focused, grounded, unapologetically alive. The silence finally broke with a single word, too loud for the quiet. "Wow." It came from a young man near the window, the one in the beanie, who'd been furiously typing on his laptop just minutes earlier. He pushed up his glasses and added, "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen happen in a coffee shop." Laughter rippled through the room, soft and uncertain, like people remembering how to breathe. Then came another voice from Mr. Ellison, the retired schoolteacher who'd been sitting in the same booth every Tuesday since 2008. About time someone put that man in his place. Dina leaned over the counter, raising her eyebrows. You all knew who he was? Half the cafe nodded. Sophie blinked. You did? He's in the papers every month, said the woman at table 7, cradling a cup of lavender tea. Real estate, tech stuff, scandals. I've seen him yell at 4 different servers here. He made Tina cry once. Sophie swallowed hard. She hadn't known that part. I don't think anyone's ever spoken to him the way you did. Added another customer, an older man with ink-stained fingers and a notepad under his arm. That was something else. No one said the word brave or heroic, but the way they looked at her, part astonishment, part quiet gratitude, said enough. Still, Sophie didn't quite know what to do with it. She hadn't meant to make a scene. She hadn't set out to humiliate anyone. All she'd done was draw a line, a quiet, invisible line. And somehow that had been enough. But the room kept buzzing. Within the hour, the story had taken on a life of its own. The guy in the beanie, it turned out, was a local blogger who live-streamed everything. He hadn't caught the moment on video, but he'd tweeted about it live. A billionaire just threw coffee on the floor at Café Central. New waitress didn't flinch. She calmly told him off. Everyone froze. I think I just witnessed the beginning of a revolution. 3 retweets in minutes. By lunchtime, it had 50 likes and a growing thread. No one said Richard Harrison's name directly, but it didn't take much to guess. Sophie, meanwhile, kept working. She poured coffee, cleared plates, listened to 2 students argue whether cats had souls. But no matter how many cups she carried or how many smiles she gave, the moment still lingered. During the quiet hour between shifts, Dina pulled her aside. How are you really? Sophie hesitated. I'm not sure yet. Dina handed her a fresh apron, warm from the dryer. I've been running this place 15 years. I've never seen anyone do what you did, especially not on their second day. Sophie took the apron with a small smile. He pushed the cup. Dina tilted her head. He pushed the cup. You stood up. They both laughed softly, but it was true. Across the cafe, a teenage girl whispered something to her mum while pointing at Sophie. A businessman who rarely looked up from his spreadsheets raised his mug in a silent salute. And the barista from the early shift left a sticky note by the register that read, "Thanks for showing us what quiet courage looks like." It felt strange. Sophie didn't think of herself as courageous. Courage was watching her mother smile through pain. Courage was showing up when disappearing would have been easier. Speaking up, that had just been dignity. Still, something had shifted. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. Later that afternoon, Sophie stepped outside during her break. The air was sharp. Snow hadn't started yet, but the sky promised it would. She leaned against the brick wall, arms folded, trying to shake the weight of the day. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. A voice broke her thoughts. He deserved it, you know. She turned. It was the college girl from earlier, blonde, maybe 20, with a sketch pad tucked under her arm. Sorry, the girl added. Didn't mean to interrupt, just what you said to him? I've waited tables for 2 years. I wish I'd had the guts. Sophie smiled softly. It wasn't about guts. It was just a line I couldn't let him cross. The girl nodded, thoughtful. Still, you reminded a lot of us we're allowed to draw those lines too. Then she ducked back inside, leaving Sophie with her thoughts and the cold wind curling around her collar. That night, legs sore and feet aching, Sophie lay in bed replaying it all, not to relive it, but to make sense of it. What had she really done? She'd told the truth, with respect, without apology, and somehow that had shaken a man who seemed untouchable. It hadn't been about power. It had been about presence. She turned off the lamp and pulled the blanket around her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Richard Harrison hadn't gone back to his office that day. He hadn't called his driver, hadn't answered a single message. Instead, he sat in his car, parked across from the cafe for nearly an hour. Not in anger, in silence. Trying to remember the last time someone had looked him in the eye and told him something true. Exactly 1 week later, on a quiet Thursday morning, Café Central buzzed with its usual rhythm. Clinking mugs, soft conversation, the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. Sophie had come to love it. The routine, the comfort. It grounded her in a life that had once felt like free fall. She was arranging pastries behind the counter when Dina leaned in and whispered, "He's back." The words felt like a gust of wind through a cracked window. Sophie turned, expecting the same man, sleek coat, perfect scarf, expensive cologne announcing him before he spoke. But what she saw stopped her. Richard Harrison stood at the doorway, hesitating. No suit. Just a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and worn leather boots. No watch, no entourage, just him. And the strangest part, he looked human. Not like the untouchable billionaire from the headlines, but like a man who, for once, noticed the room around him. Eyes across the café turned towards Sophie. Richard found her behind the counter, paused, then walked over calmly, still confident, but not in the same way. This time, something new walked beside him. Humility. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. "Miss Sophie, right?" She nodded. "That's right," he exhaled. "May I speak with you for a moment?" She studied his face. The arrogance was gone. He stood tall, but not with sharp edges. Dina nudged her gently. "Take your break. I've got this." Sophie untied her apron, wiped her hands, and led him to a quiet booth in the back. He sat opposite her, unsure of what to do with his hands. Silence. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Sophie blinked, unsure she'd heard right. He didn't rush, didn't excuse himself, just looked her in the eye. "What I did last week was wrong," he said, throwing that cup. "Talking to you like that, it wasn't about the coffee, or you. It was about me." She tilted her head slightly. "I've spent years walking into rooms like I own them," he continued. "People move out of the way, smile even when they don't want to, stay quiet because they think it'll cost them otherwise. I mistook that for respect." He looked out the window where soft snow had begun to fall. "But truth is, I haven't been respected in a long time, just tolerated." The words cracked the air. He turned back to her. "You didn't tolerate me. You told me the truth, calm, firm, and I haven't stopped thinking about it." Sophie folded her hands. "Why come back?" A small, honest smile tugged at his mouth. "Because I didn't want that to be the last version of me you remembered." There was no charm, no polished humility, just truth. "I appreciate your apology," she said. He nodded, grateful, not expectant. Then came the unexpected. "I was wondering," he said, "if you'd sit and have a coffee with me. No roles, no assumptions, just two people." She raised an eyebrow. "You want to drink the coffee this time?" He chuckled softly. "Yes, and I promise not to throw it." She watched him. Something had changed, not just in how he dressed or spoke. Something deeper. "I'll get us 2 mugs," she said. He stood to take the tray when she returned. Waited until she sat before he did. No rush, no demands, just presence. They sipped quietly. Then he asked, "Do you always speak so directly?" "Only when it matters." He nodded. "That must make people uncomfortable." "Sometimes," she said, "but I'd rather be uncomfortable than invisible." He studied her words like they had weight. "I've been invisible too," he murmured. She looked at him and saw it. A man not used to being seen, and maybe for the first time wanting to be. The noise of the cafe faded because Sophie had a feeling. Maybe the man who once tossed a cup in arrogance wasn't the full story. Maybe this was just the beginning. The coffee had gone cold, but neither of them seemed to notice. Sophie sat across from Richard in the quiet booth, her hands wrapped around the mug like it might steady something inside her that had begun to shift. Outside, snow fell in slow, whispering flakes, covering the sidewalk in a softness that made the city seem almost gentle. For a while, neither of them spoke, and it wasn't awkward. It was rare, like both were relearning how to breathe separately, but in sync. Richard was the first to speak, not about business, not with a joke, but with something unexpected. "My mother died of cancer." The words weren't heavy. They were simple, soft, but they carried years inside them. Sophie looked up slowly. Her grip on the mug loosened. He was staring at the table as he spoke, not at her. His voice didn't shake, but there was a raw edge to it, like a door long closed had finally creaked open. "It was a slow decline," he said. "She was strong through most of it, stronger than me, stronger than my father. She never complained, never once asked, why me? Even in the end, she was steady. Sophie's throat tightened. Something inside her gave way, like a knot that had been holding her together finally let go. My mom too, she whispered. Richard looked up. I took care of her for 7 years. Sophie continued, her voice barely audible. She was diagnosed when I was 25. I quit work, stopped dating, I just stayed. At first I thought it was temporary, but she never really got better. Her eyes blurred, but she didn't look away. I watched her lose everything, her appetite, her strength, her hair, but she never lost her kindness. Even when she could barely speak, she'd squeeze my hand and ask how I was doing. Richard exhaled, slow and quiet. That sounds like my mother. They looked at each other, and in that space between them, something passed, unsaid. Not pity, not comparison, recognition, like two people who had stood in the same kind of silence, held the same trembling hands, answered the same impossible 2 a.m. questions. Sophie leaned forward, elbows on the table. Hospice came near the end, but by then it was just me. I gave her morphine when the pain got too much, played her favorite music, read her poetry. Richard nodded, his eyes far away. I used to bring my mom records. She loved Bach. She'd hum along even when she couldn't speak. Sophie smiled just faintly. Mine loved Nat King Cole. And for a moment, it felt like their mothers were right there, two women from different lives, humming different melodies, bound by the same quiet strength. Richard tapped his finger against the mug. I wasn't there when she died. I had a meeting I thought I couldn't miss. By the time I got back, she was gone. His voice cracked, just enough to reveal the fracture. Sophie's voice softened. That doesn't mean she died alone. He looked at her, confused. She knew you loved her, Sophie said. That matters more than being in the room. We think timing is everything, but love doesn't live in a moment. He blinked and she saw it, the way his jaw tensed, how his breath caught and then let go, like he'd been holding it for years. She left me a letter, he said. I found it tucked inside one of her records a week after the funeral. She wrote, "Don't chase power, Richard. Chase meaning. Power fades. Meaning doesn't." Sophie's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. Did you listen? Richard smiled, but it was frayed around the edges. I thought I did. I built things, made money, created jobs. But deep down, I think I was just trying to become someone she'd be proud of. Even if it wasn't the real you. He looked up sharply, surprised, but he didn't deny it. I don't know who the real me is anymore, he admitted. I've spent so long pretending I did. Sophie sipped her coffee slowly, letting the silence breathe, not to escape the weight of it, but to honor it. You're not the only one, she said. After my mom passed, I didn't know who I was without her. I'd wrapped my whole identity around being her caregiver. And when that ended, I didn't know where to begin. Richard leaned back slightly. And now? She held his gaze. Now I'm starting over, one shift at a time. He smiled, a real one this time. Small, sincere, and you chose a coffee shop. She laughed softly. I chose people, a job where I can look someone in the eye, hear their story, make a moment feel warmer. After all that silence, I needed connection. He nodded. I envy that. For what it's worth, Sophie said, the man I saw today, he's not the same man who threw that cup last week. Richard's eyes darkened, not with shame, but with reflection. I've thought about that moment every day, about how reactive I am, about how much I've missed by walking through life without really seeing it. You saw me today, she said gently. He looked at her and really saw her, not as a waitress, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who carried the same weight of grief in a different corner of life. And for the first time, she felt seen in return. I don't want to forget her, Richard whispered. But I'm tired of being defined by the emptiness she left behind. Sophie reached across the table, just enough to graze his hand. Then maybe it's time to build something from the love she left behind instead. A long, quiet breath passed between them. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of something else. And outside, unnoticed, the snow kept falling, soft, relentless, silent. The snow had stopped by the time Richard stepped out of the café, but the sky still hung low and gray, like the city wasn't sure whether it wanted to wake up or keep dreaming. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, watching his breath fade into the cold air. Behind him, the café bell chimed softly every time someone entered or left. The world moved on as it always did, but something in him had shifted, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, Richard sat alone in the massive study of his penthouse. It was everything he thought he'd wanted: mahogany walls, a glass bar cart with imported whiskey, and a skyline view that cost more than most people's homes. But it felt cold, not from temperature, from something else, something hollow. He poured a drink but didn't touch it, just stared across the room at the leather chair that used to belong to his father. Though William Harrison had been gone 5 years, his presence still clung to the space like an unfinished sentence. Richard could still hear him, measured, commanding, always 2 steps ahead. His father had been many things: brilliant, ruthless, admired and feared. As a boy, Richard watched him own every room. People stood when he entered, laughed when he made a joke, whether it was funny or not. As a child, he mistook that for power. As a teenager, he wanted it. As a man, he mimicked it. And now, he resented it. He set the drink down untouched, rubbed his hands together, let the silence speak. And then, almost unconsciously, he said it out loud: "I became you." It hit like a confession. Not pride, not triumph, just truth. He hadn't become the man he dreamed of. He had become the man he feared. "I thought if I walked like you, talked like you, demanded things like you, I'd earn the same respect." He laughed bitterly. But it wasn't respect. It was fear. And fear's a poor substitute for connection. The truth stung, like alcohol on a wound he'd ignored for too long. He remembered the boardrooms where he barked instead of listened, the assistants who quit, the tension in every room he entered, the fake smiles, the silence that followed him, not from awe but self-preservation. And he remembered the last words his father said before dying: "Don't lose your edge, Richard. The world respects winners." So he sharpened the edge. But when Sophie stood in front of him and said, "I'm not one of your employees," something cracked. Not out of offense, but recognition. She hadn't just challenged his behavior. She'd seen through it, seen him, the man beneath the posture, beneath the suit, beneath the performance. He stood up, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out a dusty journal he hadn't opened in years. It still smelled like college paper and ambition. On the first page, written in his mother's handwriting, "Be kind to the world. It's already carrying too much." He stared at the words, then flipped to a blank page. And for the first time in a decade, he wrote. Not a speech, not a pitch, not a press release, just a thought: "I've spent so much time becoming someone I wouldn't even want to have coffee with." He underlined it. Outside, the city glowed orange and gray. People hurried down sidewalks. Windows blinked on like stars, and he wondered how many of them were also pretending. He pressed a hand to the cold glass, and in the silence that followed, made a quiet promise, not dramatic, not public, but real. No more noise, no more pretending, just presence. He would start again, even if no one noticed, even if it took time, even if he didn't know exactly how. He owed that to himself, and to the woman who showed him, without shouting, without pride, that respect isn't demanded. It's earned with empathy, and maybe with grace. The invitation arrived 3 days after their conversation about loss. Sophie had just finished her evening shift at the café. The sun was slipping below the skyline, casting soft streaks of gold and violet across the buildings, when she stepped outside to wrap her scarf tighter around her neck. Sophie. She turned at the sound of her name and saw him, Richard, leaning against a car that looked nothing like the one she remembered. Not the sleek Aston Martin. This one was a weathered, navy blue Volvo with a dented bumper and a story in its paint. Humble, unexpected. He straightened, hands tucked into the pockets of his dark wool coat. "I was wondering if you'd let me take you to dinner." Sophie blinked. "Dinner?" "No boardrooms, no fancy reservations," he said quickly. "Just a little place I used to go with my mom. It's nothing glamorous, but the food is honest. And I thought, maybe we could talk more." There was something in his tone that made her pause. Not charm, not polish, hope. She hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Okay, let me grab my coat. 15 minutes later, they were seated in a cozy booth at a small, family-run Italian restaurant nestled between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The walls were lined with framed photos of smiling patrons, faded soccer teams, and yellowed newspaper clippings. The smell of garlic and slow-roasted tomatoes filled the air like a welcome home. Sophie glanced around, smiling. This is not what I expected. Richard laughed, sliding into the booth across from her. Most people assume I only eat in places with wine pairings and waiters in tuxedos. She raised an eyebrow. Don't you? I used to, he admitted, before everything became a performance, before I forgot how to sit down without pretending. Their server arrived, a gray-haired woman named Maria, who lit up the moment she saw Richard. Richie, is that really you? Sophie turned, amused. Richie? He cringed, grinning. Only here. Only her. Maria clicked her tongue and patted his shoulder fondly. Your mother would be proud, you know. You never came back after she passed. I wasn't ready, Richard said softly. Maria looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Sophie. You must be someone special. He never brings anyone here. Sophie offered a modest smile, her cheeks warm. When Maria left, Sophie leaned forward. You really came here as a kid? Every Sunday, Richard said. Mum loved the lasagna. I was all about the meatballs. We always sat in that back corner near the jukebox. She used to make me dance to Sinatra while we waited for dessert. She tried to imagine it, Richard, smaller, twirling between tables with clumsy steps and a wide grin. It was impossible. And yet the softness in his voice made it real. She sounds like she was incredible. She was, he said, eyes a little distant. And this place, it was ours. No expectations, just us. Their meals arrived, his childhood favorite, and a fragrant mushroom risotto for her. They ate slowly, not out of awkwardness, but with the reverence of two people tasting memory. Midway through dinner, Sophie set her fork down. Why bring me here? He didn't answer right away. He glanced around, the crooked frames, the flickering candles, the scratches on the table that had likely been there since his last visit. Because I wanted you to see the part of me I don't usually show. She tilted her head. Why me? He met her gaze. Because you don't pretend I'm someone I'm not. And maybe that's helping me remember who I really am. Sophie's chest tightened. She watched the way he sat now, not with entitlement, but with quiet presence. Like a man learning how to show up without armor. And in that dim corner, surrounded by marinara and music from an old jukebox, she saw him. Not the billionaire, not the broken heir, just a man, trying. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Her love of old bookstores, his obsession with abandoned buildings, the way music could ease grief, how quoting movies had once been their private therapy. They laughed, genuinely. And when silence settled between them, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. Later, as the restaurant emptied and candles burned low, Richard stared at a faded photo on the wall. A boy dancing awkwardly with a woman wearing a scarf and bright eyes. That's her, he said quietly. Sophie stood beside him. His mother looked radiant. Even frozen in time, her smile had motion. It made you want to be better. She'd like you, he whispered. Sophie looked at him. You think so? I know so. They stood in silence. Then Richard turned to her, softer now. I don't know what this is, Sophie. I don't want to rush it, but tonight, I feel more like myself than I have in years. She nodded gently. Then let's not rush. Let's just keep showing up, one meal at a time. Outside, the cold returned. He offered his coat. She didn't argue. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. But something passed between them as they stood. Under the glow of the restaurant sign, warmth that lingered in the space, between words. And somewhere inside Richard, something long frozen began to thaw. The second time wasn't planned. Sophie had just left a bookstore near her apartment, a second-hand place that smelled like stories, when she spotted him leaning against a street lamp. A paperback in hand, collar turned up against the wind. He smiled, not the polished smile from headlines, but one that made him look years younger. I was hoping I might run into you. Sophie raised a brow. Here? I asked Dina where you go after work. She said you have a thing for forgotten books. She told you that? She might have hinted, he said, holding up the book. I was hoping you'd help me pick one out. She stepped closer. Are you saying you read? I used to, he said, before spreadsheets replaced soul. She laughed. All right, let's find your soul again. They walked back inside together. The bell jingled. The scent of dust and pages wrapped around them like a worn sweater. Sophie wandered the aisles, occasionally handing him books with a mischievous smile. This one's about a guy who loses everything and ends up running a flower shop. Tempting, Richard replied, flipping the cover. But I kill plants. This one, she said, holding out a worn book of poetry. Pablo Neruda. He took it gently, opened to a page, and read to himself for a moment. Then softly, I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. Sophie froze. He looked up. I used to love poetry. What happened? It started feeling like a luxury I couldn't afford, like something I had to abandon to be taken seriously. Do you miss it? All the time, he said, slipping the book into his coat pocket. But I think I'm ready to remember. They checked out. He insisted on buying the book and sat on a nearby bench, the bookstore lights painting the sidewalk like a quiet stage. I've never told anyone this, Richard said, voice low. But before finance, I studied architecture. Sophie blinked. Really? I was obsessed with the way buildings affect people, their emotions, the way a space can breathe with memory. He looked at his hands. But my father said architecture was for dreamers, that I needed to build things that scaled. She didn't interrupt. His words felt like pages turning. I used to draw chapels, museums, treehouses. I had this idea once, to design a library, with skylights shaped like open books. She smiled. That's beautiful. He met her eyes. I miss that version of me, the one who created things just because they were beautiful. Silence again, but soft, shared. And music? She asked. Every night, he said. Chopin when I need to think, Debussy when I can't sleep. Do you dance? He chuckled. In my living room, alone, curtains closed. She laughed, surprised. Don't judge. Some people run marathons. I twirl to Mozart. That might be the most charming thing I've heard all week. He looked at her, then at the book in his coat. You make it easy to say things I thought I'd forgotten. Maybe, she said gently. You just needed someone to remember with. She opened the poetry book and placed it between them. Let's read one, together. They bent over the pages like kids sharing a secret. And as the words passed between them, something else passed too. Not a confession, not a promise, just presence. He whispered, I've spent so long becoming who I thought I had to be, that I stopped seeing the parts that mattered. You're seeing them now, she replied. Thanks to you. She didn't answer, because she didn't need to. He wasn't trying to impress her anymore. He was remembering himself, and somehow in that remembering, he became real. The next time Richard walked into Café Central, everything looked the same, and yet everything felt completely different. There was no dramatic entrance, no loud phone call, no designer coat tossed across a chair, just a man in a navy sweater, hands in his pockets, scanning the room not with entitlement but with intention. He paused to hold the door open for an elderly man with a cane, nodded respectfully to the couple by the window, and when he reached the counter, he waited in line, waited. Sophie noticed him, of course, but all she offered was a soft glance. She was mid-conversation with a young mother, gently wiping a spill after the woman's toddler had knocked over a cup of milk. When Richard reached the register, it was Jonah, the college student who covered mornings, who greeted him. Good morning, sir. What can I get for you? Richard smiled. Black coffee. And please, call me Richard. Jonah blinked. Okay, Richard. Sophie didn't react outwardly, but she noticed. She noticed the way Richard stepped aside after ordering, rather than hovering. The way he looked at people, really looked, not to size them up but to see them. When his coffee was ready, he turned back to Jonah. You always work mornings? Most of them, yeah. Richard nodded. You're good at this. You keep things moving. That's a skill. Jonah smiled, genuinely taken aback. Thanks, man, seriously. And just like that, Richard made his way to his usual seat, carrying his own cup. Dina watching from the kitchen window. leaned towards Sophie and whispered, "Did we step into a parallel universe?" Sophie smiled, still watching him. "Maybe we just saw someone wake up." Over the next few weeks, that shift became undeniable. Richard started coming in regularly, twice a week, sometimes more. But he no longer sat like a man used to being served. He sat like someone learning to listen. He stopped giving orders without eye contact, stopped correcting people mid-sentence, stopped mistaking intimidation for respect. Instead, he asked questions.
How long have you worked here?
"What's your favorite thing on the menu? Is Dina always this terrifying, or is it just Mondays?" He even started leaving notes on the receipts. Not just tips, those were still generous, but words. "Thanks for remembering the extra napkin. Best espresso I've had in months. You're doing great, seriously." Little things, but they mattered. The staff began to notice. They began to soften, not all at once. Trust takes time. But the tension that used to ripple through the café, whenever his name was mentioned, slowly began to ease. Because real respect, it always leaves a trail. One afternoon, Sophie passed by his booth and noticed something new. No laptop, no spreadsheets, just a sketchbook. She paused. Richard looked up, caught her eye, and smiled a little shyly. "Old habits," he said. "I'm drawing again." Sophie sat across from him without asking, "Can I see?" He hesitated, then turned the book around. It was a rough sketch of a cafe. Not Café Central exactly, but something similar. Warm beams, wide windows, light that felt like morning. Sophie traced her finger near the page's edge. "It's beautiful. It's honest," he said. "That's all I want to be now." Their eyes met. And in that moment it was clear this wasn't redemption. This wasn't performance. This was a man quietly rebuilding something real. Later that week, Dina pulled Sophie aside. "I was skeptical," she admitted. "Thought he was just putting on a show. For you." Sophie looked at her. "And now?" Dina exhaled. "Now I think maybe this is the real him, and we're lucky enough to see him come back." The following day, Richard showed up with pastries for the entire staff. Not from a trendy bakery, but from Angelo's, a tiny corner shop run by an older couple. "These remind me of the ones my mom used to bring home on Fridays," he said softly, handing out the boxes. The staff gathered, surprised and quietly touched. Sophie picked up a croissant, turned it over. "You remembered my favorite?" He nodded. "I've been paying attention." And she saw he had. How he lingered after close to help Jonah stack chairs, unasked. How he kept poetry tucked in his coat, sometimes leaving books behind open to marked pages for someone else to find. How he waited for her outside, not to protect her, not to escort her, just to walk beside her. Their bond deepened not through declarations, but through the quiet repetition of care. In how he spoke her name like it was something sacred. In how he asked not just "How are you?" but "How are you really?" And most telling of all, how he began treating everyone the way he treated her. Because transformation isn't proven in how we love the few. It's revealed in how we see the many. One evening, as Sophie was closing, she found a folded note under the register. It was from him. "I don't know if I deserve a second chance, but I know I want to earn one. Not just with you, but with the world I forgot how to see." She folded the note, held it to her chest and smiled. Because somewhere between spilled coffee, shared poetry and quiet sketches, Sophie had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, people really could change. And sometimes, all it took was someone brave enough to speak the truth, and someone humble enough to hear it. It didn't begin with fireworks. No kiss in the rain. No sweeping declarations. The beginning of Richard and Sophie happened the way real things do, quietly, steadily, in the spaces between all the rest. It had been weeks since their dinner at the little Italian restaurant, since poetry in the cold, since long glances and silences that spoke louder than most conversations ever could. They had kept seeing each other, sometimes by chance, often by choice. A walk through the park, a trip to the bookstore that turned into tea, even a visit to the flea market, where Richard bargained clumsily over a vintage lamp and lost. But there were no labels. No "Are we dating?" No "What are we?" Just presence. And somehow that had been enough. Until one evening, everything changed. It was a gray Tuesday, lightly drizzling. The cafe was slow. Sophie had stepped out during her break, sipping mint tea under the awning, watching raindrops trace lazy lines down the glass. Richard appeared with an umbrella and a paper bag. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, offering the bag. "Chocolate croissant. Still warm." She raised an eyebrow. "Angelo's?" "Of course," he said, sitting beside her. "I may be a recovering tyrant, but I have standards." She laughed. "You're not a tyrant." He looked down. "I used to be. I'm trying to remember who I was before I forgot how to be kind." She didn't say anything, just tore the croissant in half and handed him a piece. "Here," she said. "Proof you're redeemable." They ate in silence, the rain softening the world around them. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking." She smirked. "That's dangerous." He smiled. "It is, but here goes." He shifted slightly. "I don't want to keep meeting like this forever. Not that I don't love it, our walks, our talks, our shared pastries, but I've been wanting to say something, and I'm afraid if I wait too long, the moment will pass." She waited. "I want to take you out. On a real date," he said. "Not just coffee or books. Not just quiet evenings under umbrellas. I want to choose you, on purpose. Sit across from you and know we both showed up for the same reason." She held her breath. "There's no pressure," he continued. "I just didn't want to stay silent." Sophie looked at him. Not the man who once walked into boardrooms like he owned the world, but the one who now read poetry, brought pastries, and remembered how to be present. "I was sure 2 weeks ago," she said softly. His eyes widened. "You were?" She nodded. "I was just waiting to see if you'd get there too." He smiled, truly smiled. "Then let me do it right." And he did. No limos, no rooftop dinners, no headlines, just a small jazz club behind a flower shop on West 32nd. The kind of place his mother once loved, where the vinyl crackled between sets and candlelight, made everyone look a little softer. Sophie wore a navy dress, Richard a grey blazer and no tie. They ordered shrimp linguine and red wine. And when Ella Fitzgerald began to play, he stood and offered her his hand. "Dance with me?" She hesitated, then rose. He didn't lead like someone trying to impress. He moved like a man finally grateful to be seen. They swayed gently, her head resting lightly near his shoulder. Their steps unsure, but their connection certain. After the second song, they sat. "I didn't expect any of this," Sophie said. "Neither did I," Richard replied. "But I'm glad," she added, "that it didn't begin the way love stories are supposed to." He tilted his head. "Why?" "Because the ones that surprise you usually mean the most." And just like that, they became something more. Not with a title, but with trust, with choice, with something real and quiet, built between two people who once lived behind walls and were now sitting face to face, finally unafraid. Outside, the city kept moving, but in that little corner booth, under dim lights and soft jazz, a new chapter began, and neither of them felt any rush to reach the end. 6 months later, the light inside Café Central felt different. It wasn't the bulbs. Those were still the same warm, aging yellows Dina had refused to replace for years. It wasn't the tables either, still slightly uneven, or the mismatched chairs. But something in the air had shifted, something quieter, brighter, as if the space itself was holding its breath for something beautiful. It was late afternoon on a Thursday, and the cafe was unusually full. Not loud, not chaotic, just full in that meaningful way. Regulars sipping familiar drinks. Students typing like deadlines were breathing down their necks. Even Maria, yes, Maria, the server from Richard's childhood restaurant, had wandered in, claiming she was just in the neighborhood. And Sophie? Sophie was behind the counter, smiling to herself for no particular reason. She wore a soft gray blouse, her curls loosely pulled back, and a silver pendant at her collarbone, the one Richard had tucked inside, a Neruda book, and given her on a rainy evening that neither of them could forget. She was wiping down the espresso machine when she felt it. A hush, not silence exactly, but a shift, like the room had exhaled all at once, then leaned in to listen. She turned, and there he was. Richard stood at the center of the cafe, a to-go cup in one hand, the other raking nervously through his hair. He wore a navy sweater and dark jeans. No suit, no mask, just Richard. the version only she truly knew. He looked around, hesitant, searching, until his eyes found hers. Then he walked, slowly, deliberately. Conversation paused. Dina froze mid-pour. Jonah lowered his phone and raised an eyebrow. Sophie blinked. "What are you?" He reached her, set the cup gently on the counter. Her name was written on it, in his handwriting. She looked at the cup, then at him. Then he stepped around the counter, reached into his coat pocket and knelt. Not with spectacle, not with bravado, but with a kind of quiet reverence that made time bend around them. A soft gasp rippled through the café. Richard looked up, his voice steady but layered with feeling. "Sophie," he began. "I walked into this café a different man, arrogant, closed off, hollow. I thought I was looking for coffee, but I found a mirror." Sophie's hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled. "You didn't just change me," he said. "You reminded me how to feel, how to listen, how to love, without pretending." From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box, worn at the corners, like it had been opened and held many times before. "My mother once told me that real love doesn't come crashing in like thunder. It builds quietly, gently. I never understood that. Until you." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring. One delicate stone. No glitter, no grandeur, just beauty and truth. "I don't want a perfect life," he said. "I want an honest one. One filled with mint tea and bookstore walks and quiet dinners after long days. One with you." His voice dropped barely above a whisper. "I want a life with you." Then louder, so the room could feel it. "Sophie, will you marry me?" The silence didn't break with noise. It broke with stillness, the kind that vibrates, the kind that lives just beneath tears. Sophie stepped forward, then again. Her hands trembled as she reached for his. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes." The cafe burst into applause. Not wild, not theatrical, but full, warm, real. Dina wiped her eyes behind the counter. Jonah fist-bumped a stranger. Maria clutched her purse and nodded, as if she'd known all along. Richard rose, slipped the ring onto Sophie's finger, hands shaking with joy. They didn't kiss right away. They just stood there, forehead to forehead, breathing in the moment between heartbeats. And then, softly, she kissed him. Not for the room, not for the photos, but for every moment it took to arrive here. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the golden light outside had faded to soft gray, Richard and Sophie sat in their usual booth. 2 cups, 1 ring, 1,000 shared memories in every brick. "You planned all this?" Sophie asked, smiling as she traced the rim of her mug. "Every detail," he said proudly. She narrowed her eyes. "Even Maria?" He laughed. "Okay, maybe not every detail." She chuckled and leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't talk about dates or guest lists, no big plans, no Pinterest boards. Instead, they talked about a little reading nook they wanted to build in their new apartment, about a second-hand chair from the flea market that needed reupholstering, about nothing and everything. Because love, they had learned, doesn't always live in the grand moments. It lives in the ordinary ones made sacred by presence. In the way 2 people can sit in a worn-out cafe, surrounded by mugs and quiet music, and feel like the whole world has paused, just for them. The next day, Café Central opened like any other Friday. Muffins lined the glass case. The espresso machine hissed and steamed. Jonah spilled milk again. Dina muttered, louder than necessary, but her eyes crinkled with a smile. But the energy was different, not because of balloons, not because of signs. There weren't any. That wasn't Sophie's way, and it wasn't Richard's anymore either. What had changed wasn't visible. It was in the way people looked at them, with quiet admiration, with respect, not for what they had, but for who they had become. The man who once barked orders and threw coffee now held the door for strangers, wiped his own table, sat beside Sophie often in silence, content just to be there. That afternoon, a woman Sophie had never seen before approached the counter, polished, sharp heels, crisp blazer. She ordered a latte, glanced around, then asked, "Which one is he?" Sophie didn't have to ask what she meant. She nodded toward the corner booth. The woman studied him, then looked back at Sophie. "You're marrying that Richard Harrison?" Sophie smiled. "No, I'm marrying this Richard Harrison." The woman raised an eyebrow. And what's the difference? Sophie didn't flinch. The one you knew never stayed to help clean up. This one does. Later that night, after the cafe had closed and the quiet had returned, Richard stood behind the counter sweeping crumbs into his palm. He popped a piece of hidden chocolate into his mouth, one of Dina's stashes for the night shift. Sophie leaned against the sink, watching him with a smile. "You know you're not on payroll," she teased. He shrugged. "I'm just here for the company." She stepped closer. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why here?" she asked. "Why propose in the cafe?" He set down the tray and dried his hands. "Because this is where I stopped pretending," he said. "This is where I stopped being who the world expected and started becoming who I actually want to be." She nodded, understanding without needing more. He continued, quieter. "I used to think respect came from power, from control, from being the man everyone moved out of the way for. And now I think it comes from presence, from kindness, from making space for someone else." He looked at her, not as a man who had conquered anything, but as one who had surrendered. "I didn't have an identity," he admitted. "I was living inside a name, a legacy, but with you, I'm just Richard." She touched his cheek. "And that's more than enough." He exhaled and took her hand. "I used to walk in here like I owned the world," he whispered. "Now I walk in grateful just to be invited in." She leaned against him, their fingers interlaced over the counter. Outside, the sky faded from gold to dusk. No speeches, no cameras, just two people choosing each other, not for attention, but for the quiet after. Dina flipped the sign to closed. Jonah counted the till, yawning like a stage actor. The lights dimmed, and as Sophie and Richard stacked chairs, wiped tables, swept the floor, each motion felt sacred, not because it was perfect, but because it was shared. When the last light clicked off and the door locked behind them, Sophie paused beneath the crooked sign above the cafe. Richard followed her gaze. "It's not much," he said. She smiled. "No, it's everything. Because this wasn't just where she started over, it was where he did too. Not with a press release, not with a grand gesture, but with presence, with truth, with quiet, consistent showing up. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And maybe that's what real love is, not a performance, but a practice, a daily choosing, in mint tea and folded napkins, in how are you really, in I see you, and even softer, I'm staying." He once thought respect was something you demanded, but in loving Sophie, Richard learned, true, respect is something you give, gently, consistently, every day, not with power, but with presence. And maybe the bravest thing a man can do is choose who he wants to become. Because in the end, this wasn't just a love story. It was a story about remembering who you are. And maybe, just maybe, it's also about all of us. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? Your presence here means more than you know.